Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women's Legislative Network Monthly Boost. I'm Ann Sappenfield. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Legislative Council and the staff chair of NCSL, staff vice chair of NCSL. I'm delighted to moderate this webinar that celebrates Women's History Month and honors the many contributions women have made, not just to legislatures, but also to the entire workforce. Before I move to the program portion today, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's event is a platform for development, information exchange, and engagement. While we've all become more familiar with Zoom, I have a couple of reminders. We encourage you to use the chat box to submit questions, and if there are questions that you have answers to, then submit your answers in the chat box. You can also use the raise hand feature on Zoom to let us know that you have a question. Last, please take a minute to review your name. Click on the three dots in your box and insert your legislative title or organization and state so we can easily identify who has joined us today.
Okay, so it's back at the login screen.
Think of this as your networking badge. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website, along with themes for upcoming boosts and registration links. We'll put that link in the chat box. Please feel free to share the site with your colleagues and staff. Now on to today's program. I'd like to introduce Megan McClure, co-host of the Building Democracy podcast series and a policy analyst with NCSL's Legislative Staff Services program. Megan will share some information about women in state legislatures and changes made by their presence in state capitals. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and we'll add them to the Q&A portion of the program. Megan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, Ann, and hi, everybody. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to celebrate women in legislatures with you all today. It's been a distinct pleasure to work on the Building Democracy podcast, where I, along with my NCSL colleagues, legislators, legislative staff, and scholars have told the stories of legislatures from the first meeting of the Burgesses in the Jamestown settlement in 1619 to the challenges and innovations that are driving legislatures into the future now. Today, I'm going to share with you some stories of some women in legislatures, women who in territories and newly formed states in the West insisted on their right to vote and hold elective office well before the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. These stories are in the 4th episode, and in that episode, I got to interview Colorado Representative Meg Froelich, Wyoming Senator Affie Ellis, and Rebecca Clark, who's a historian with an organization working to highlight the role of women in Utah history. And we explored the stories of prominent women who fought for their rights and ran for legislative office in the West and how they changed the legislative institution. And I'm going to add an extra plug to just, if you have any questions that come up, throw them in the chat. I'm going to cover a lot of information. And so feel free to ask questions. I'm going to put up some slides here real quick. Excuse me for just a second while I do this. Okay, so, sorry, one more second while I pull up my notes again. So Senator Ellis in Wyoming, she told us about a few Wyoming women and a specific set of events that led to the territory being the first to legislate suffrage for women. Julia Bright, who was a suffragist, but also happened to be the wife of the Territorial Council President, William Bright. She, along with Esther Hobart Morris, who was a woman of means, who'd run up against some sexist banking and property laws after the death of her first husband. These two ladies are credited for creating pressure for women's suffrage legislation in the Wyoming Territory. And it was this pressure, along with racist motivations to suppress Black Americans from voting. There were motivations to encourage immigration into the territory, along with the belief that it probably wouldn't pass anyways, that led to the legislation making its way to the floor, being voted on, and then it passed. So the Wyoming legislated women's suffrage in 1869. And also during that session, they recognized equal pay for teachers regardless of their gender, and also some protections for property for women whose husbands were absent. Esther Hobart Morris went on to become the first woman justice of the peace, or a judge, in the United States. And then in 1870, so the next year, Louisa Ann Swain became the first woman to vote in a general election. Here's a caveat. There's lots of caveats and very specific firsts in these types of discussions. So she was the first woman to vote in a general election since 1807, which was when New Jersey revoked women's suffrage. So before 1807 in New Jersey, their constitution gave the right to vote to, quote, all inhabitants. And they also used the gender neutral they. And so this meant that from 1776 to 1807, women and African Americans voted in New Jersey. And then in 1807, the law was rewritten to exclude women and minorities. So kind of pay attention to these first when I call them out. They can get kind of technical. So Wyoming was the first, Louisa Ann Swain was the first to vote since 1807 when New Jersey's laws changed. So after Senator Ellis, we spoke with Rebecca Clark, who is a historian with Better Days 2020, about Utah's fascinating and complicated history when it comes to women's political participation. Women in Utah fought and won the vote, not once, but twice before 1920. First in 1870, when the community feared for their safety and religious freedoms, women consolidated an alliance with the Mormon leadership in the territory, and they quickly passed suffrage legislation just a couple months after Wyoming. And then when enfranchisement of women, there was an assumption back in DC that enfranchising women would help get rid of the practice of polygamy in the community. And when that didn't happen, and after 17 years of women voting in Utah, Congress rescinded that legislation, so they lost that right. But that didn't stop them, and women's suffrage and the right to hold office was included in the Utah State Constitution when it was ratified in 1895. And it's because of that ratified constitution that I get to tell you all about Martha Hughes Cannon. She was the first female senator in the United States. She had 4 degrees by the time she was 25, and she was a prominent doctor and orator in the Latter-day Saints community. The second that new constitution was ratified, she registered to vote. And then the next year, she ran for one of 5 open Senate seats. And her opponent was her husband. So he ran on the Republican ticket, she ran on the Democratic, and she won. And then I want you to remember Representative Alice Horn here, because we're going to come back to both of these 2 women here in a second. So then we talked to Colorado Representative Meg Froelich, and she told us about how in 1893, after years of grassroots organizing and campaigning by local and national suffragists, and on the second try in 17 years, Colorado became the first to recognize women's enfranchisement via a popular referendum. So Wyoming was the first to legislate, Colorado the first to do it via popular referendum, which meant that Colorado women had convinced enough of their male peers to vote for the referendum, which had been put there by the legislature, which meant they had convinced enough legislators to get it on the ballot in the first place. So Representative Froelich told us the story of the first women to be elected to a legislative body. The year following the passage of the referendum, Clara Cressingham, Frances Clock, and Carrie Hawley were those first women. And like many of the first women elected to statewide offices, their legislative career wasn't very long. They all served single 2-year terms. And we don't have much information about what they did or said while in office. But after Clara, Carrie, and Frances, and Martha, and Esther Hobart Morris, more and more women begin to get elected to office, and that makes for some changes. So now that we've heard about these women and the fights and the elections that they won, how did the women change the legislative institutions that they worked in? As more women were elected, women's issues and viewpoints found their way onto chamber floors, and women's sensibilities and needs necessitated changes, not only to how legislative business was conducted, but to the capitals themselves. In Wyoming, after Esther Hobart Morris is elected as Justice of the Peace, women began to serve on juries, were elected to school boards, and then eventually to statewide office. Nellie Tayloe Moss became the first woman to be inaugurated as governor in 1924, after elected to finish off her husband's term after he had died. She and Ma Ferguson of Texas, they were both elected on the same day, but Nellie was inaugurated first. In Utah, you have Martha Hughes Cannon, and in her push, she wanted to legislate a state board of health. And she created an alliance with Alice Merrill Horn, which was that other woman that I had mentioned. She was a representative in the House. And Alice wanted to legislate a state art institute and art collection. So they teamed up together to apply pressure to their male colleagues in their respective chambers for each other's legislation. And then on the day of the crucial votes, when the votes came up for that legislation, the two of them scattered yellow daffodils on the desks of their peers as a reminder of the support that they had of Utah's women and the need for that to be taken seriously with their legislation. Then in Colorado, and that legislation worked. They did legislate a state art institute and collection and a board of health. In Colorado, having women in the chambers meant no more spittoons next to the desks on the floor, no more smoking cigars, no more hobnobbing with lobbyists on the chamber floor, and you better wear your gloves and take off your hat, because there was a notable change in decorum after more women were elected to these offices. And it also changed the legislation that was passed. Representative Froelich told us about a laundry girl bill that was passed in 1912 that provided protections for young women working in unsafe conditions in the industrial laundries in Denver, which is where I'm at. She also told us about Agnes Riddle, who was a two-term senator in 1910, who spoke up about a bill that was being proposed on the floor to lock down the sex workers in the red light district here in Denver. And she stood up and spoke to her male colleagues and said, "Why shut the gates of hell on the girls and not the men who visit them? Who among you would not be locked in?" Needless to say, the only person who voted for that bill was the sponsor after she got done talking. And then eventually some Capitol renovations become necessary. There were no women's bathrooms adjacent to the Colorado House chamber until the 1970s. Female representatives had to walk all the way over to the Senate side of the Capitol to use the restroom. This caused them to miss votes and clock a lot of extra steps compared to their male peers in the House. And Colorado was by no means the only capital. State capitals across the nation started to have to add bathrooms. Now we're seeing nursing rooms and things like that coming into the capitals. But Colorado was not the only one. The first women's bathroom wasn't installed in our National House of Representatives until 1962 and not until 1993 in the Senate. So this was a whirlwind trip through some fascinating history that I love, and I glossed over a lot, but I hope that you all are intrigued and you want to learn more, and you'll go listen to the full episode. Like I said, this is episode 4, but there's 6 episodes. All of them are my favorites. But I want you to hear these women's voices and stories, along with, we covered the history behind Tennessee's role in ratifying the 19th Amendment. We covered the growth of women's legislative caucuses and go into a lot more detail on these stories. There's also a bonus interview on the Building Democracy feed with two professors, one from the University of Minnesota, one from the University of South Dakota, who tell many more stories from lots of other states. Don't feel left out. We've crammed as many stories in as we can. And I just look forward to your questions during the Q&A portion, and I hope that this reminder of the legacy that you are all a part of helps to give you a boost as your session winds on, and thank you all.
Thanks, Megan. That was so interesting, and I am going to check out more. You really piqued my interest. Thanks so much. I was also excited to see NCSL share and promote this Building Democracy podcast in the latest state legislature's news. So we'll all have to check that out. Our next speaker will share some milestones around equity in the workforce. Taryn McKenzie Williams is the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Disability Employment Policy. In this position, she advises the Secretary of Labor on how the department's policies and programs impact the employment of people with disabilities and leads the Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, or maybe you pronounce it differently, which works with employers at all levels of government to promote evidence-based policy that improves employment opportunities and outcomes for people with disabilities. Taryn, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here with you this Friday. It was funny, you were saying 12 o'clock, and I'll note that I'm coming in today from Washington, D.C., right in the middle of the city, and I'm always excited to be able to talk about equity, particularly equity in the workforce during Women's History Month. I'll frame what I'm going to share by noting that I come to any conversation about equity as a Black woman with a non-apparent disability. And this is an intersectionality that has shaped both the person I am, but also the work that I do and the career path that I've found myself on. As you just heard, I serve as the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Disability Employment Policy. We call it ODEP. We're quite friendly with acronyms in the federal government. So ODEP, for those of you who aren't familiar, we are a sub-cabinet level agency within the U.S. Department of Labor, and we report directly to the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. And we were established, I would say, about 21 years ago to facilitate greater collaboration across policies, programs, and agencies to promote employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And as part of that, we work very closely with our sister agencies, including our Women's Bureau. So I'm really pleased to be here representing the Department of Labor and our collective efforts to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in our nation's workforce. During Women's History Month each March, as you all know, we pay homage to the central role that women of all backgrounds have played in shaping our nation and the world. And among these women are, of course, women with disabilities, including legislators with disabilities. And one example that we often talk about in the disability community is Barbara Jordan, a woman that I greatly admire. Born in Texas in 1936, Jordan was one of many firsts, the first Black woman elected to the Texas Senate, the first Southern Black woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and the first Black woman to deliver a keynote address at a national political convention. What is often not discussed about Jordan is that she was also a woman with a disability. She is someone who was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1973, shortly after being elected to Congress. And she wasn't entirely open about her MS, often attributing her use of mobility devices to a bad knee. We don't know exactly why she did that, but perhaps we could speculate that she likely feared facing stigma and discrimination similar to that which she experienced growing up as a woman of color. Her choice not to publicly disclose her disability highlights a universal struggle that many of America's marginalized populations, especially those who are multiply marginalized, face on a daily basis. I would say, although not openly active in the disability rights movement, Barbara Jordan did pave the way for future generations with intersecting identities to advocate for both themselves and their value. And certainly there's a new generation of women legislators with disabilities carrying on that legacy. And some of those examples include Arizona Representative Jennifer Longden, one of the first wheelchair users to serve in the state legislature. And there's also Georgia Representative Kim Schofield, who was very open about having lupus. So I want to share just a little bit about where we are in this moment in time, particularly as women, as we enter this new phase of the pandemic. There are a few examples of the countless women who have made significant contributions to women's history, disability history, and American history. And during Women's History Month at the Department of Labor, we work this month and every month to really honor those legacies by seeking to advance employment and economic empowerment for women, including women with disabilities. And in the wake of the pandemic, we know this is critical. COVID-19 has exacerbated the challenges women already faced with employment discrimination, workplace sexual harassment, pay inequity, and limited advancement opportunities, while at the same time underscoring how threadbare our care infrastructure is. In the early part of the pandemic in April 2020, the unemployment rate for adult women was 15.4%, the highest unemployment rate ever recorded since the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, began its data collection in 1948. And that rate was even higher for women with disabilities. In fact, we are currently experiencing the lowest female labor force participation rate in 33 years. The Biden administration is committed to addressing these challenges and building an inclusive recovery. We know we must seize this opportunity to address deep and long-standing inequities that continue to hold back women, people of color, people with disabilities, and working families. However, we also know to accomplish this, we must ensure that every job is a good job, where people have a family-sustaining wage, where they have access to sick time, paid leave, reasonable accommodations, the opportunity to union organize and bargain collectively if they choose to exercise that right, and a workplace that is free from harassment and discrimination. As a nation, we can and must use the current historic investment in infrastructure to transform our labor market by recruiting, training, and retaining women from all backgrounds into these career paths. A little bit about how we envision getting there. That includes opening and expanding pipelines to careers in infrastructure, including through inclusive apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs with robust supportive services that help women and enter and then stay in the trades and other non-traditional careers. It also means funding a care system, including child, elder, and home care that works for everyone who needs care while raising wages for the women who provide this essential work. It means ensuring access to fair wages, paid leave, sick time, and reasonable accommodations, and their free and fair opportunity to join a union. And of course, it means enforcing existing laws that actually address and tackle gender and sex-based workplace discrimination. Some of these solutions will be addressed at the federal level, but as so many of you know, states and localities are where the impact of policy is felt. That is why ODEP created the State Exchange on Employment and Disability, or SEED, as we call it. SEED helps states and localities implement policies that advance the employment of people with disabilities and strengthen their economies in the process. Key to SEED success is our work with organizations like the Women's Legislative Network and NCSL. You guys are key partners for us. And really put simply, SEED acts as an educator and hands-on policy guide to state policymakers like you. We offer background on disability employment-related policies and practices, show you where inclusion intersects with your own policy agenda, and if needed, help you shape your own effective policies and put them into practice. An example of that is in 2021, and SEED worked with New Jersey Assemblywoman Shanique Spike to draft a package of legislation to enhance employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And earlier this year, the governor signed 2 of these bills into law. One to advance the state model employer of people with disabilities, and the other to create a fast track hiring protocol. It's also important to know that SEED is cross-disability in focus, improving employment opportunities and outcomes for people with all types of disabilities. Certainly, we are a very rich and diverse community, and so this, of course, includes our nation's disabled veterans and many Americans who have recently acquired a disability due to COVID-19. Our goal for SEED has always been to promote disability as part of diversity. Truly, that is one of the main goals of our agency. People with disabilities are a significant part of every underserved community because disability is a diversity lens that cuts across all others. We know that 1 in 5 working age Americans has a disability, and we are hearing in some places that it is 1 in 4 who have had COVID and who may be experiencing long COVID related disabilities. And certainly there are some early studies that indicate that women may be at a greater risk of long COVID symptoms. So we are looking closely at research and trends related to long COVID and developing new resources to address the emerging needs of both workers and employers related to long COVID. So as we work to ensure America's economic recovery, recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, we want to ensure that it is powered by inclusion. And I truly encourage all of you to explore opportunities to collaborate with SEED. We have an incredible team, some of whom are represented on this call today. And I see dropping information and resources in the chat. So I just want to shout them out. And certainly I want to thank you again for having me. And I'll simply leave you with a vision for what our future could be. It is one of full inclusion. I would love to see an American workforce that truly represents and reflects the diversity and talents of all of our citizens, including women and people with disabilities from all aspects of life, and racial and social equity infused into all of our workforce policies and programs, and a world in which all people, including women and those with disabilities, have unlimited employment opportunities. That is certainly the vision, then the dream that fuels me on a day-to-day basis. And I believe, and I have seen, I'm new to my role, but certainly I spent more than a decade in the agency, and I have had the opportunity to witness firsthand that it is with the help of policymakers, particularly at the state and local level, that we can make this dream of inclusion a reality. So again, thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to any questions you may have now or as they emerge in the future, because this partnership of SEED is one that is for a long term. But I think I'll stop there and turn it back over.
Great. Thank you so much, Taryn. That was really interesting. And oh, there's still a lot to work on, right? If you all have questions, please put them into the chat or raise your hand on Zoom, and we can get to those questions. I was sort of interested to hear, first we heard the discussion about women legislators and women in legislatures and how, the changes that were made and the types of policies they went forward with. And then to hear a lot about things like, I was curious when you talked about the lack of enforcement of sexual harassment laws and where you see some potential in that area.
Sure, that's a great question. I can say as an administration, so I'm speaking holistically, not only for the Department of Labor, but as we look across our sister agencies and departments like EEOC and the Department of Justice, that we are exploring and seeking to leverage all of the levers that we have available to ensure that women and individuals with protected identities aren't experiencing discrimination in the workplace. We know that there have been so many challenges over just the past several years with respect to the pandemic, but even before then, we knew that there were individuals who were experiencing harassment and or discrimination in the workplace, and that is something that we take very seriously, and that includes robust enforcement of the laws that we have available to us to prevent that from happening.
And then do you have any examples of the types of things you're working on with state lawmakers with SEED, or that you hope to?
Sure. We have tons of examples. I've been doing a lot of the talking, but I really do want to shout out that the team is here. I see just on my screen, Nadia, I think Katya is available as well. Nadia is a senior policy advisor with ODEP, who really is our lead within the agency for the seed work. And I would invite her to share maybe an example of two of some of the work that we're doing in seed around the nation.
We are working with women legislators in Tennessee. For example, Senator Becky Massey, we've worked with her over the last several years to ensure that transportation, for example, is a major issue for people with disabilities as it relates to employment. So they established an office in Tennessee specifically devoted to ensuring accessibility of transportation. And it's one of the first in the nation. There are also a number of other women legislators that we're working with, and we've begun conversations with a number of organizations representing Black women legislators and women legislators from a variety of backgrounds.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will just add one other thing, because what I love about what Nadia shared is the example of transportation. And I gave a quick overview of the work that ODEP does. And perhaps I would say, just to go a level deeper, when we talk about advancing employment for people with disabilities and advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, we not only think about every aspect of the employment life cycle, so recruitment, hiring, retention, and advancement, but also about what are the supports that need to be in place to ensure that an individual is earning, as I said, a family sustaining wage. And that can include critical infrastructure like transportation. It includes considering policies, workplace policies like family medical leave. And so we really do take a broad perspective when we're thinking about the systems and the policy agendas that we're seeking to influence, because we know it can really touch any part of an individual's life and make the difference with their workplace success.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And Megan, I was wondering if you had any examples of initiatives, policies that were started by women that have really stood the test of time and made a difference. You know, the fact that there were women in the State House really made a difference for those policies.
I can't off the top of my head think of
I'm sorry.
specific things. But I mean, you really saw the rise of women in the workforce issues, labor protections, you know, the laundry girl bill that Representative Froelich told us about, you know, was very much, you know, there were young girls there that today we wouldn't appreciate seeing in a working environment, but it was to protect them and would go on to, you know, help bolster the fight that happened, you know, to limit child labor and things like that. I think kind of a great thing about Esther Hobart Morris, the first Justice of the Peace, is that she had no formal legal training whatsoever when she was put in the position of the first woman Justice of the Peace, but none of her rulings were ever appealed or never overturned when they were appealed or anything like that. So I feel like her kind of stepping into that legal space and being a very positive representative of women at the time kind of stands the test of time moving forward as women participated on juries and things like that.
Yeah, it sounds like she really had to do her homework.
Very much.
Well, thank you, Megan and Taryn, for spending time with us today as we celebrate Women's History Month. and the impact of women in the workforce. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So before we adjourn, I would like to have some interaction by using the chat function or raising your hand. We hope to share some fun historical facts about women in your legislature. Or please share if you have a first, if you are the first in a role in your state. I'll start with a fact about Wisconsin. We were the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. So we celebrated women's suffrage starting in 2019. Also, a fact about NCSL officers. There have been 9 women presidents in the 47-year history of NCSL, and I will be the 13th woman to serve as staff chair starting this August. So if you could share things like the number of women in your legislatures, the approximate number of women who are legislative staff, you know, any of those types of facts, I'll monitor the chat and look for those hands. I do know that in Wisconsin, we have the highest percentage of women in the legislature that we've ever had. So it's still not half, but we have made a lot of progress recently.
I think this may have changed, but this is what we had in our podcast, was that Colorado and New Mexico are majority women legislatures. I'm not sure if post our most recent election that's still true. Of course, Nevada became quite the majority female legislature a couple elections ago. So those were kind of highlights in the West.
Interesting. In Wisconsin, we also have the highest number of women Supreme Court justices, but we don't have the highest percentage because that would be Oregon. So we're keeping track. Well, if you don't have any questions, I would like to extend a final thank you to our presenters. Oh, here we go. Maryland, 72 women legislators. That sounds like a good number. That's great. Thank you. So thank you to our presenters. Thank you to the attendees. This was a really fun and interesting hour. So I was excited to be included in it as well. As a reminder, there will be a recording of today's webinar available on NCSL's website. Please don't forget to register for the next monthly boost on Friday, April 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Have a wonderful weekend and happy Women's History Month. Thank you.
Have a great weekend.